earlier in the talk, this morning, you had mentioned that one thing that often helps certain grants be differentiated from others is that they're not just putting something into a new setting and not just implementing it somewhere else, but if there's also some novelty about the advance of the science in some way, and I think it seemed like we were maybe speaking to a methodologic advancement or innovation. Could you elaborate a little on what you meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, it probably depends a bit on the field and the stage of the field, but, for example, if there's a new method, a statistical method, complex systems modeling that has never, so right now it's been applied in certain fields, but if you've searched the literature and it's never been applied in our field, and these systems modeling kinds of studies definitely can be D&I studies. So that could be an example where we're applying a new method, an old problem, but a new method trying to address that problem. Sometimes it could be a theory, it could be an analytic approach, it could be a new way of reaching a high-risk population that hasn't been reached before. I don't know, it could be any of those, I think.
Let me give you a concrete example that isn't quite on target because it actually was just a internally funded study, but we didn't do for a grant. But in the early days of ReAIM, we were trying to push this issue of reach, okay, and particularly who is the representatives of people that are being reached. So one thing we did to try and both show how the model could work, but push it a little bit with some methodological innovation is because we were approached by diabetes educators who really, their question was they had a curriculum that they knew worked, but nobody was coming. And it was an in-person group meeting, and so what they wanted to do was test out a DVD and look at the pros and cons of that. And the methodologic innovation, so again, ReAIM made sense there because it was a reach issue, but the methodologic innovation that we did there was instead of just using a standard RCT, if you think about it, which was pretty much at that time almost required thing, is we used what was called a hybrid preference design, randomized design, because the fundamental question was about reach. Okay, but if you think about a randomized trial, what's the requirement to be in a patient? You have to be willing to accept randomization to anything, to either of the interventions that's going to be there. So it's kind of a logical impossibility. If you had a strong feeling and you weren't willing to participate in one, you wouldn't participate in the RCT. So we kind of walked through that and showed the limitations. But then we did this hybrid design where half of the people were randomized to choice. Okay, and the other half were the traditional RCT that we did. So it was this mixed design, so we're kind of fitting this theory that's focused on reach, but we had this component where we could look at the choice, and that's really the bottom line that does truly answer the question about reach. What do people prefer and what will they participate in? But then, to satisfy the people, the scientists concerned about internal validity, because there's self-selection issues, if we just let them choose, the other half then were randomized to be in this standard randomization condition.
So
yeah.
You basically randomized to, or trying to just get you to repeat study so that we were taking this really again.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you guys did. So you randomized to choice or RCT, so then individuals that were randomized to the RCT were randomized again to the...
Correct.
Okay, that's...
Correct. You can think of it as a 2-by-2. We analyzed it differently. It was either arbitrarily from this whole registry of people that they were randomized to either have choice, to be approached with a choice, which is the way it would work in the real world, by the way, too.
Yes.
If you're going to, you say, hey, you got these couple options.
Exactly.
You can come in person or do this. So we argued that had more external validity, too. Or you could be in the more traditional randomized condition. And then we also looked to see, if you will, if there were any interactions. So it was choice or randomization, and then these two, the traditional in-person or the DVD.
Okay. And did you find that with the choice that it did improve reach?
Interesting. What we found is the DVD apparently was a good one on the outcomes that we had, both biologic and kind of self-management. It did as well, and over 4 times as many people were willing to do the DVD or chose to select that. So huge win on reach, but it was kind of like remember Deb Ritzwaller on the cost. It wasn't so much on the effectiveness measures. They were pretty much equally effective, not much difference there, but here the home run was on the reach. We showed they could get 4 times as many people.
Yeah.
with the same effects.
Hi. And just regarding my case in specific, I was talking to her. I'm an MD, and I've always done clinical work, and now I'm transitioning to research. And so in terms of publications, it's all about like clinical reports and anything, nothing of much weight. So you were talking about the investigator factor, and how could I improve my chances given that, considering the fact that I'm starting, so I'm considered early investigator, but I'm not that young yet.
Yeah.
I have 10 years of career behind me. So how could I improve this view?
Well, the first thing I do is I'd ask 3 different people, because they'll have 5 different answers for the question, and somewhere there'll be a good one in there. The most thing, and then see, Ross may have better responses than I do. One is I would maximize what you have, or think about, making lemonade out of lemons. So I think Ross said it earlier, or somebody said, who are the best implementers, the people that understand? They're the people that have been in practice. It isn't the academics that sit there. It's the people that have real clinics. So I would really play that up and focus on your opportunities that way. Second thing is I would look for a really strong team and partnering with an experienced investigator. Third, I would try to have some pilot data that Ross said. I think pilot data is probably even more important if you're and it doesn't have to be the world's perfect study, but just have some pilot data to go in.
Yeah.
Ross?
And I would only say, sort of in the grant world, start with small grants. Start with, if there's institutional grants you can apply for. Often, are you here, Colorado? Yeah. So often institutions, universities have $5,000 to $8,000 pilot grants that are targeted for new faculty and new investigators. Or in the NIH world, the R03 grant is $50,000 for 2 years, which, for most grants is pretty decent size when you're starting out. But for NIH, it's the tiny grant. And so start out with those, and then focus on getting. And I think I agree with everything else Russ said, but also focus on some data sets and some ideas where you can get some publications out pretty quickly. So the track record you have will be building up in the areas where you want to build your research now.
Yeah. I just add to that in terms of other grant sources. Often foundations, I think, have less of a, getting late in the day, trying to think of a politically appropriate word, but get their shorts in a knot less about you have to have 100 publications before they'll consider, funding you or whatever.
Yeah,
So,
and the voluntary agencies, Cancer Society, Heart Association, Lung Association, Alzheimer's, you can name off the different groups. Whichever groups might line up with your work, they often have small grant awards and sometimes have new investigator things as well.
And so somebody has to ask a final question here right before Borsika asks us the third time, and we still don't have the answer.
Yeah, so we're not giving the mic back to Borsika.
I have a question about sort of computerized delivery of interventions. So if you have, let's say, a pretty strong evidence base for in my field is, I'm a clinical psychologist, so a psychotherapy for depression, for example. And you're looking at trying to increase access by having a computerized version of it. At what point do you need to sort of start through the pipeline again and show that you haven't changed, just your delivery method or your strategy hasn't changed the intervention so much that you actually have to go back and show effectiveness or efficacy? At what point, is...
That's a tough one. You want to start that one?
I'll try. I think if I was stuck with that, I would think, one, about going to theory. What's the theory that it's based on? And then I would, like you say, then I'd look at the kind of the evidence-based components that you have there. But it can be a tough one. The other thing that I think sometimes can work is if this is a relevant question to you that you're interested in, usually these are done in person to start with, and then is do a comparative study. So you can actually show, and then sometimes you can get away with that, even though that's kind of the innovation, is the innovative one, but we're showing that it's evidence-based on the principles and the theory, but we're going to look and see. That's part of the test here.
So it is an effectiveness study. Right. The other is, think of this hybrid design for bridging from an effectiveness trial to an implementation study. And maybe you're a hybrid one, so you're still going to have a large effectiveness component, but you're thinking about where it's going to go later. And that would be the other thing to add.
And we'll send you a reference on these. That's one omission we made on the hybrid design studies. They're starting to get a lot of traction.
Can we do a couple? We had a couple more questions down here. Can we do a couple last quick questions?
This, I think, will.
Yeah.
Okay. I think will be quick. Is just your kind of gauging of the funding world. Is it worth going for a DNI grant in response to an FOA that isn't explicitly DNI these days, or without an example of DNI in their scope?
So a funding announcement that's calling for like an effectiveness study, but you're thinking of writing a DNI study, or?
It could be any number of things. My world is it's a lot of community-based health, so there's all sorts of things out there that aren't necessarily effectiveness studies, but not explicitly DNI.
Yeah. I mean, I think you always want to write to what the funders are asking for. So you might include a DNI component in a study, but still align it with whatever the main goals of that FOA is looking for. And usually having some DNI component can never hurt it, but if it's not the primary goal of the funder, then I wouldn't align it that way.
Yeah, two answers. I generally agree with that. The first one, of course, is it depends, which is absolutely not helpful, but it's true. And the second one, and I can't believe we omitted this, Ross, is talk to your program officer at the funding agency, whatever institute is. They are going to be the best one. And call them. They can't always put things in writing and stuff like that, but set up an appointment. In general, what they like, because they're really busy too, is like a one-pager, your specific aims, or at most a two-pager, summarizing both your issues and then your questions. But then, please don't be bashful. This is their job, is to talk. You're their constituents, and they're the one that's going to help you answer all these things that we said. It depends. They're going to know what the review group is. They're going to know what was discussed behind the scenes and stuff like that. So always talk. That's another key thing, that you talk to your program officer.
And it's even more important now than ever, because there are a lot of these grants that end up sort of on the bubble, that 10 years ago would have been funded, but now they're kind of in the iffy zone, and that's where the program officer can go to bat for you. But they're unlikely to go to bat for you if they've never heard from you before till you need a favor. And so if they know early enough that, hey, this is a project I looked at, I remember it, the person's been in touch with me, you can usually tell if they're excited about the idea or not, because a lot of these program officers are very high-level researchers themselves. And so they've got certain things they're interested in. So that's one we need to add. Often when we've done these sorts of presentations, one of the presenters is a program officer, so they're saying that, but it's a really important one. One more over here. Did you have a question?
I have a question, but it's not directly related to this. It went all the way back earlier today, and I didn't get to ask it, which is the question of adoption. If you're doing a research study, the people who are willing to participate in both an implementation and research project are probably different than the sites or settings that are would have been willing to just do the intervention by itself. And so I often struggle with that, because I've certainly had organizations I want to work with say, well, I would be willing to adopt the implementation, but I don't want to do the research. And I'm just sort of wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, it gets a little bit to this response burden and what you're asking them to do. If you can think of it sort of in between, definitely someone who's willing to put up with all of our questionnaires and all the times we're going to want to interview them and talk to them, they probably are somewhat different, but if you can demonstrate even how they're different from those who didn't participate, sort of the non-respondent things, and then as we go through, I had one project where there were these long questionnaires on the built environment. Well, our research study was to develop a user-friendly measure of the built environment that any practitioner group would be willing to do. And so sometimes there might be and that was the research project. And so sometimes there might be a research goal that could even be looking at reducing the burden.
So 3 different answers quickly. First of all, you're absolutely right. It isn't the same. Sometimes what we've done is call the research one potential for adoption, and then the other, when you don't have the research, the actual adoption or whatever. Secondly, I think, as you heard a number of times today, the thing that you can do is think about ways to minimize the burden. And often that's one way you can be innovative, is really minimizing the burden on the settings. A quick example was that BeFit, Be Well project we talked about. We didn't go in and say, oh, the primary care doc, we're only going to take 5 more minutes of your time. I mean, they've heard that 100 times. We said, it's not going to take any of your time. It's going to take something else and a different staff member. So think about how you can minimize the burden. And I think with that, I just forgot the
only one other
third
thing
answer.
I would say is, at least when we work with agency people, if we promise that we will feed back to them the evaluation results, and they can use that in their own quality improvement issues, even though they know it's a research study, they know that's coming later, and they know that's going to be a benefit for them, and it'll often get people involved who necessarily aren't interested in research, but they can see a benefit. I mean, because people in this field, they want to do better. They entered the field because they want to make a difference. And so if they can see something that leads to their quality improvement, or potentially does, that's been a really big thing for us in working with a lot of agency people.
Yeah, I remembered what I was going to say. The other one, it's quasi-related, but that I think has been a game changer for me. So when I approach settings, instead of doing it like I used to do, and I still think a majority of people do, they come in and say, can we just get 50 of your patients, to be in this study or whatever? Often I would approach it, I think it's a better answer, say, we want to work with you to design this so that it will work and be feasible in your study. So I only want you to participate if this is something you'd be interested in doing after the study's over. And again, we'll work with you to try and do that, but really you should only participate if this is something that you'd like to, continue to do, or if this is, important enough for you to carry on otherwise.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much.